That's right, Nana. Delighted to be joined by Nick Thomas-Symonds, because, Nick, you are really leading the government's negotiation with the European Union.
Yes,
there are a lot of GB News viewers and listeners who are concerned that this deal will have an element of freedom of movement with it for younger people, and that will rise the number of people coming into this country that has already had a huge amount of migration. What do you say to those concerns that our viewers might have?
So, first of all, it isn't freedom of movement. Good to join you, first of all, Tom, on GB News. But we made a promise at the general election that, yes, we would certainly be looking for a better deal than we have at the moment with the European Union to facilitate trade, keep our borders safe, bear down on bills. But that we would not rejoin the customs union, we would not rejoin the single market, we would not go back to freedom of movement. And
well,
that is absolutely
you
what
have
we will not
rejoined
do.
the single market in some ways, not in its entirety, but with agricultural rules, for example. We have to follow whatever the EU decides now. The deal that the Prime Minister struck means that, for example, if the EU bans a pesticide, that has to be banned in the United Kingdom.
Just to unpack two things. First of all, a youth experience scheme would involve both young Brits being able to go to the EU, and yes, young Europeans being able to come here to live and to work, experience different cultures, but it will be capped, it will be controlled, and it will be in the context of the 13 youth mobility schemes we've currently got with countries around the world. So
how would it be capped? Because obviously we've got youth mobility. Interesting that you're calling it an experience scheme rather than a mobility scheme. Can we just call a spade and call it a youth mobility scheme?
You can call it a youth mobility scheme, but it'll certainly be great opportunities to have experiences for young people. But it'll be capped by a number. Okay.
What is that number?
Well, that is to be negotiated, but I see the number in the context of the schemes we already have. But can I just come back as well to the point you've just made about food and drink agreement, because you put a challenge to me about it. We are taking away and going to be taking away fees that are being paid by businesses up and down the country today. So today, to export to the EU, they have to pay £200 for an export health certificate per consignment, £61 for an identity check. You're talking about some lorries, thousands of pounds in fees. This government's going to take away.
But you go and you meet these European negotiators, you stare in their eyes, and you've rolled over.
Absolutely.
You've rolled over on their demands. Let me just finish the point. Because what you have said is the only way to get rid of these checks is to accept EU rules on what's known as SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. To accept EU rules. If the EU bans something, it has to be banned here. If the EU change the way that something's regulated, we then have to change. Hasn't that just reversed the entire point of what leaving the European Union was about, which was setting our own rules? Wouldn't it have been better to ask the European Union to say, look, food in the UK is safe. We know it's safe. It's very high standards. Why can't we do mutual recognition?
Absolutely not. And there are businesses up and down the country that are already actually manufacturing, producing to EU standards now, for which we are getting absolutely no benefit. But just to be clear how this process works. First of all, we have an opportunity to shape the rules when they are first proposed, whether it be a directive or a regulation. Secondly, yes, we are taking a sovereign choice to align with another high standards jurisdiction. That is why, in the same month, we secured a free trade deal with India, an economic deal with the United States, and a better deal with the European Union. That is an exercise of sovereignty. And finally, where there are disputes, and there may well be, we have £800 billion of trade every year with the European Union, there will be an arbitration panel. And people talk about the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice's role in it is only to do with interpretation of European Union law. The arbitration is not binding on the overall dispute. And you take any free trade agreement, Australia, New Zealand, with India, you always need that mechanism, that independent arbitration mechanism, and we're doing it because it's in our economic interest.
That is a very normal, and obviously in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement we had an arbitration mechanism. What you've done is go further than that, which is to follow EU rules in specific areas. Now that's a trade-off. You say it will facilitate easier trade. I would
take away huge numbers of fees, Tom.
I would put to you that you could have negotiated something better, where the EU would accept our rules and we accept their rules with a mutual recognition agreement.
No, I think what I have negotiated is actually the best possible agreement.
The best possible agreement is to blindly follow EU rules.
No, the best possible agreement, I can tell you, is to take away the fees that businesses are paying.
By following EU rules.
The consequence, let's be absolutely clear about this. if the position, and by the way, I mean, in credit to you, Tom, you're actually engaging in the argument after the deal's been signed. But Kemi Badenoch said she was reversing this deal before she'd even seen it, as did Nigel Farage. And the consequence of that is what they are saying, is that businesses will have to again pay the fees that we are going to take away. £200 for export health certificates, £61 for identity checks. If you get chosen for sampling, we're talking like well over £1,000. Now, I have a deal that takes those checks away, that facilitates trade.
No, you have done that by rolling over to the EU's demands.
No, I haven't done it by rolling over to the EU's demands. But what the Conservatives and Reform are going to have to explain to businesses up and down the country in the agri-food sector is why they want to reimpose those charges. And by the way, I enjoy this debate, and I'm going to look forward to that debate as well.
That is fascinating, because of course, if the EU rules are going to be enforced here, are farmers going to be particularly happy if the EU decides to ban a pesticide, decides to do something anti-growth and over-regulatory when it comes to the agricultural sector, which we know the EU does. That's their entire modus operandi. That's the common agricultural policy writ large.
Tom, there are things as of today, British bangers, for example, certain types of shellfish that we cannot export to the European Union, that we will be able to export again. And my message to the agri-food sector is that I want to see British produce that I'm really proud of on plates right around the European Union, and they are going to be able to do that to export
if they follow
more easily
EU
and cheaply. But in most sectors that's already happening. Shall
we park agriculture for a second? Because migration is something that a lot of people will be concerned about. We started the conversation with it. You said there will be a cap with this migration deal with the European Union.
It's not a migration deal, it's a youth mobility deal.
A youth mobility migration deal.
For a specific period of time, people are not able to come and bring dependents or claim benefits or anything like that. It's a very specific form of scheme. It is not
Can we just hash out at the end of this interview some numbers? Because you say there'll be a specific period of time and there will be a specific cap.
Yes.
Can you give me either of those numbers today?
Well, obviously not, because I'm just about to go and negotiate those things.
You can tell us what you would like to see. Is it a 1-year deal, a 2-year deal, a 3-year deal?
These are subject to negotiations. I'm obviously not going to cut across it. Much as I respect coming on your show, Tom, I can't negotiate via you with the European
Union. You can tell us what you want. When Theresa May went to negotiate with Brussels, she gave a big speech saying, this is what I would like to achieve. Yeah. Can you tell me that today?
Of course I can. And I've already given you that answer.
No, you haven't. You haven't told me what you'd like the cap to be, and you haven't told me how long the time of people being able to move to the United Kingdom would be for.
No, I haven't given those two specific points.
Those are the only two numbers I've asked for.
What I have done, though, is told you what I'm looking for, which is a deal that is in the context of the deals we already have. Nobody says we've got freedom of movement with Uruguay. Nobody says we've got freedom of movement with Australia. Nobody says we've got freedom of movement with Andorra, but they are all countries that we have existing youth mobility schemes with. And that is the shape. I've talked about a smart, controlled youth mobility scheme. You can see them operating in practice. I don't think your viewers would describe any of those things as freedom of movement.
Well, the remarkable thing about the Australian deal is it's two-way. It's very balanced,
just
right?
As this one's going to be. Just as this one will be two-way.
Will this one really be balanced when we know that lots of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, have a much lower level of economic development than the United Kingdom? And what we historically saw when we were members of the European Union was the flow was basically entirely one way. Far more people came into the United Kingdom than left.
With respect, there was no cap. So the cap obviously does make it balanced. So I want to talk about this in that respect as well, because you've quite rightly asked the question about young Europeans coming here. But I want to make the case as well for the opportunity for young Brits to go, live, travel.
What is a young Brit? Am I a young Brit? I'm 29 years old. Would I be able to travel?
I think you would qualify as young.
If I was 6 years older, would I be able to qualify?
Well, that again is subject to the negotiation at the moment.
So, okay, look, we don't know how old young people are. We don't know what the cap will be. We don't know how many years this will be going on. I mean, is this another situation where you're going to go over to Europe, sit down with your opposite numbers, and roll over again, just like you did on agriculture?
I haven't rolled over on agriculture. I've got a great deal for agriculture. But I'm obviously not going to be able to give you the conclusion of a negotiation before I've actually conducted it. So I'm sure you would appreciate that, Tom. But what I will certainly come out of this with is a deal that's in our national interest, that will give young people here in the UK. I'm happy to count you as young for these purposes. Who knows? You might want to take advantage of the youth mobility scheme. Who knows? You might do extremely well in a career in the EU. Who knows? But listen, I will come back back with one that's in the national interest, that's a smart, controlled scheme in the context of the youth mobility schemes you already have, and I'm going to be very proud to carry out that work.
Okay, well, we haven't yet got those numbers. We will keep pressing you for answers on that. But Nick Thomas-Symonds, thanks indeed for joining us here live at the heart of the Labour Party conference.